I hope you're enjoying your catch-up week and you're using it to actually catch up on your homework if you've fallen behind a little bit. That's totally fine. That's why we built this week in. Or you could be using it to make some improvements to your past exercises and get more feedback from your TA. Or if you're really on top of things, just take it easy and enjoy this extra content. What I'm going to talk about in this video is how some of these tools that you're seeing between Photoshop and Illustrator are pretty similar, but you might have noticed that they behave just slightly differently. And I want to talk about why that is and even get into After Effects a little bit, give you a sneak peek of what that program looks like if you've never seen it before, and talk about some of the tools in there as well. So first I'm going to jump here into Illustrator and start drawing something with the pen tool. So let me just draw a shape. This is just a simple stroke on a path, right? And this is what our paths look like. We should be used to this by now. We've got anchor points and handles, the default blue color line. Makes sense, right? And the stroke is aligned to the center of the line. If I open up my stroke palette, that is the only alignment I can do on an open path, aligned to the center of the path. If I were to close the path, just by closing this up, then I have the option to add it on the inside of the path or the outside of the path, but only when it's closed. So again, if I break this path up, so it's just an open path, I can't do anything with the alignment. I'm stuck with the center. Now that's never been a problem for me inside of Illustrator, but I want to jump into Photoshop. So let's go over there, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to press P on the keyboard and start drawing. So first thing I want to point out is that I have options up here that I can draw as a path or a shape. There's a distinction in Photoshop that there isn't in Illustrator. A path is just an empty path with no styling on it at all, and that's because you can use a path like this in Photoshop as a vector mask, or you can use it on a shape layer. So if I wanted to add styling to this, I'd have to come up or down to this menu here and say something like solid color, and then I'd choose the color I want it to be. I'd tell the path if it needs to be subtracting or adding, and then if I wanted to add a stroke instead of a fill, I'd have to fiddle around with this, try and figure out where those controls are. Okay, they're up here. Now, obviously, it'd be much simpler if from the start I would have just said shape, because then I have my controls right there already, letting me know how it's going to style a path before I start drawing. So let's take off the fill. This looks a little bit different than Illustrator, obviously. I'm going to add a stroke, and then let's just make it 10 pixels. And then I'm going to draw a path just like I did in Illustrator. Okay, so it seems pretty much the same. My handles look a little bit different than they did in Illustrator. Remember, the handles here just have these solid circles, and in here they're outlined for whatever reason. But if we take a nice close look, we zoom in here, you'll notice that the path is not aligned to the center of the stroke. By default, for whatever reason, it's allowing me to align this to an edge of the path. If I come up to my options up here, my styling options, this little menu right here controls how the stroke looks. And if I click on more options, we can see that the alignment is set to the inside of the path, even though it's open. I can move that to the center, and I can move it to the outside too. I don't really know why you would ever want to do this. Maybe you could think of a reason, but I never have. I would prefer the behavior to stay in the center of the path and not allow me to move it outside my path, just like in Illustrator, because that's what I'm used to. Unfortunately, you can't. You cannot set the default behavior of styling a path inside of Photoshop to align to the center. And as far as the display of these anchor points and handles go, I don't think I can change that inside of Photoshop, but I can come into Illustrator, go to my preferences, and say selection and anchor display, and then change the way that the handles look. So you can see the filled or empty. So I can make that the hollow outline view, and I can also increase or decrease the size. You'll notice that right now the handles are smaller in Illustrator than they are in Photoshop. So I could bump that up one notch and then click OK. And now my paths look pretty much identical to the way they do in Photoshop. So if that bothers you, you have the ability to make the two programs look a little bit more uniform. Honestly, that's never bothered me. It's never gotten in the way, but be aware that that's something you can change. Now I'm going to jump into After Effects, which I know you may not have seen before, but this is what it looks like. And there is a pen tool inside of After Effects, just like Photoshop and Illustrator. And if I start clicking and dragging, it's going to give me a vector path exactly the same way. Handles look a little bit different, more like Illustrator had them by default, but I have controls up here similar to Photoshop where I can control the width. It's going to align it to the center of the stroke, and in After Effects you actually cannot change the alignment of the path. It is always on the center, doesn't matter if it's open or closed. So there's a little difference that's sometimes kind of frustrating. Back in Illustrator, we have the text tool, T on the keyboard. I can click once and start typing something, scale it up, change the font. Pretty basic. I have controls for the alignment of the justification on the edges. I have, kerning, leading, all of that basic stuff. And if I go into Photoshop, I can do the same thing. I'll get rid of this layer. I press T, start typing something, press Enter to apply it and scale it up. I can change the font to something else. And I've got my basic controls over here as well for justification, for the kerning, the leading, all of those controls are pretty identical. In After Effects, I'll do the same thing. We'll type something new, and then I'll make it black. I've got a character panel over here. I can scale this up or down. I've got controls for the leading, for the tracking. Those three type tools are pretty much the same between programs. There's slight differences between each of them. I think that Illustrator has the most advanced typesetting tools, but overall you can pretty much do anything with type in all three of these programs. Alright, let's go back into Photoshop and talk about adjustment layers. So let me just make something crazy real quick, like a gradient with a whole bunch of different colors, something like this. And I'll make it radial, just for fun. Alright, now under my adjustments panel I could add something like the hue and saturation adjustment layer. There it goes, it affects everything below it, and I can adjust the hue, the saturation, the lightness. All of this is non-destructive. Inside of After Effects, I'll do something really similar. I'll make a new shape layer the size of my composition, and I'm going to also fill that with a crazy gradient, and then make it nice and big. Don't worry about how I'm doing this. I'm not trying to teach you how to use After Effects, just showing you how these programs are a little different. Now, in a previous lesson, I mentioned that adjustment layers in After Effects are a little bit different. They can do more than just make adjustments like you do in Photoshop. In After Effects, you can apply any effect to an adjustment layer, and that will translate down to all the layers below it. So first I have to make a new adjustment layer. This is empty. It doesn't do anything on its own, but then I could apply an effect like color correction rather, and then find hue and saturation. This looks a whole lot like it does in Photoshop. I can adjust the hue, I can adjust the saturation, and I can adjust that lightness. Unlike Photoshop, however, I could add any other effect, like, let's say, a noise, and then just the basic noise effect, and turn that up, and that is going to affect everything below this adjustment layer. So if I were to type something out, like hello world, and put that below the adjustment layer, it's also going to affect that layer. I can't tell you the number of times that I've wished this type of behavior was inside of Photoshop, with a much quicker, non-destructive workflow of being able to apply effects regardless of whether or not you're using smart objects. I think it would be an amazing way to work inside of Photoshop, but that's just how it is. You can't work this way inside of Photoshop. Alright, let's take a look at another tool. Inside of After Effects, we also have a clone stamp. Remember, this is the tool that I used to put the third eye on the model for that Snifflin ad. Well, inside of After Effects, we actually have that same capability, but on top of video. So this is footage of me for one of my YouTube tutorials, and I'll show you how this works. I can grab my clone stamp. I can, just like in Photoshop, hold down Option to choose my source. Let's choose my mouth, and then paint a mouth over top of my eye. Okay, that's weird. I'm going to do that again on my other eye. There we go. And now if I hit play, I've got three mouths coming out of my eyeballs. Now, obviously, some stuff messes up as I move my head around. This is a little bit more tricky to get to work exactly the way that you want. But nonetheless, there you go. You can use the clone stamp inside of After Effects just like in Photoshop. Now, I don't have tools like the healing brush that does a lot more advanced blending for me inside of After Effects, and my brushes inside of After Effects are nowhere near as advanced as they are inside of Photoshop. But another tool I have inside of After Effects, just like Photoshop, is the Puppet tool. And in After Effects, it's actually much more advanced than Photoshop, and it allows you to make something like this. This is the reason why it's called the puppet tool, is because you're able to rig characters, character artwork that was created possibly in Photoshop. This particular one was, and then turn it basically into a puppet that you can then use to animate. Now, if this kind of thing excites you, you can learn all about this in some of our other courses like Character Animation Bootcamp or Rigging Academy. But using the puppet tool inside of After Effects allows you to bend and warp these limbs so that you can animate your characters in a much more intuitive way. So now that we've seen and compared some of the tools across these three programs, I want to give you a little bit of a history lesson behind these three programs at Adobe and talk about why they're so similar but have these weird, quirky differences. Well, first of all three of these programs were created by independent companies. Illustrator was created by Adobe. It was developed in 1985 and initially released in 1987. So that was their baby. They made Illustrator. Photoshop was independently developed in 1987 and was pitched to both Apple and Adobe, and eventually Adobe bought it in 1988. That's the year I was born, so Photoshop is officially as old as I am. And I can pretty confidently say that if Adobe had not purchased Photoshop, if Apple got it, then Adobe may not even be in existence today. It's really what has carried Adobe into becoming the massive corporation that they are. Now, After Effects was developed by a completely independent group of people, and they didn't start developing that until the 90s. It was independently released by them in 1993, but they were developing it and even calling it internally the Photoshop of video. So they were very specific in wanting to develop tools like Photoshop, but for video application. And their little company was acquired by a bigger company, and that company was in turn acquired by Adobe in 1994. So these three programs were developed by all different people, which means that all of the coding for all of the programs was completely different, and they were developed in different years, even in different decades. So it's no wonder that the tools that are similar across these platforms behave a little bit differently. The people who developed After Effects were trying to make tools that were very similar to Photoshop and behaved in basically the same way, but because they were coding it separately from Adobe, inevitably things were different. But over the last couple of decades, Adobe has done actually a really great job of bringing these programs together and making them seem like a more cohesive set of programs that were meant to work together. But along the way, they acquired massive other programs and have lots and lots of different things in their suites that all need to work together. There's InDesign, which is a print tool that needs to work well with Illustrator for the print world. And then there's Lightroom for the photography world that needs to work well with Photoshop. And that's just some of the bigger names. There's tons of tools in the Adobe Creative Suite that are all designed to work as well as they can together. And Adobe has just made really great strides in unifying their entire collection of software. You just have to remember that not all of these programs were developed by the same team, and Adobe has teams for each one of these programs that are working independently of each other today. So let's just think about the uses for Photoshop. There's photography. Obviously, Photoshop, that was pretty much what it was initially designed for, was doing photo retouching. But then there's things like app and web design that Photoshop is used for. There's tools in it for product mock-ups so that advertisers or people who make products can actually show what their products would look like before they were actually made. There are tools inside of it for 3D printing and 3D modeling, which is insane. It's pretty much something I've never touched, but it's there. There are tools for that. You can do digital painting in it, which is more applicable to something that a motion designer might use, but then obviously there are tools that we use in motion design and animation. You can even do animation directly in Photoshop, frame by frame. There are definitely better programs out there for doing frame by frame animation, but the fact is, you have tools in Photoshop that allow you to do it. Illustrator is used primarily, I would say, for print design, but it is a vector-based program, so that means that it can be applied to lots of different things, not just print. It can also be used for web design and branding as well as for motion designers. And then you have After Effects. After Effects isn't just an animation tool, it's also used for special and visual effects, for compositing explosions and bullets and things like that, and doing title design. And you can even do a little bit of 3D inside of After Effects. The point of all this is that Adobe has a massive base of users that are using their programs for hundreds of different things, and they're trying to make all of their programs accessible and useful for each one of the users, regardless of what they're trying to use the programs for. That's an incredibly tough job, and the fact that the programs are as similar as they are now, even though they're mostly developed by completely separate companies, is pretty impressive. And the way that things are today with their subscription model, where you just pay a monthly fee or pay it all at once for a year, and you get all the updates as soon as they're ready, is something I am a very big fan of. It's giving us access to new features as they come out and improving the programs on a more regular basis. Not even too long ago, Adobe pretty much rewrote the code for how After Effects renders inside of your computer so that it sped up a lot of things with the way that it handles video, and it under the hood is completely different. On the surface, you just basically see a performance improvement. And as time goes on, they're just going to continue to improve these programs and give you access to new tools all the time. So as you're going through just even Photoshop and Illustrator and you're seeing these tools that are pretty similar but behaving differently, don't get frustrated. I know it is frustrating when something isn't working the way that you expect it to, but the reality is these tools were designed by different people and for different purposes. So try to just get used to how you're going to be switching between programs and how the tools behave slightly differently. It's something I've had to do, and it's something every motion designer is going to have to do. And I don't want that to discourage you from using one program over the other. You should be using these as tools and use the right tool for the job. Like I've said before, I view Illustrator as the best vector graphics building program, and Photoshop as the best raster graphics program, and After Effects is hands down the best animation tool that I know how to use. And Adobe has really made an ecosystem between these three programs that's created a really great workflow. You can easily swap graphics between programs and get what you need done pretty easily once you understand how it all works. So don't let those little differences get to you. Keep your chin up and enjoy working with these programs. Have fun and try and just find workarounds when you get into trouble like that. And as always, you can look on Google if you can't find how a tool works or you're not understanding why something isn't working the way that you want it to. All right, that's all for this little bonus lesson. Enjoy the rest of your catch-up week, and I'll see you next week.